is Sumit Srivastava, a FIDE-rated chess player and a professional chess coach. So today I came with another interesting chess topic, which is how to identify threats in chess. As all we know that chess is a game of threats, and threats happen all the times in chess. So if creating threats is on one side of the coin, we can say that identifying threats is on the other side of the coin. So let's start to understand.
Now, identifying threats is actually a skill that is never fully mastered in chess, right? Because you are still going to always, no matter how good you are, miss a threat from time to time. Because chess is a game where threats are happening all the time. That even though your understanding might be excellent, even just a small lapse in concentration can cause you to miss one. There are many different factors that we need to take into account in order to identify threats. And it's impossible to do an exhaustive analysis of all of them. But what I'm going to do is I am going to touch upon briefly by showing you some example positions. I'm going to touch upon some of the major points and then some of the minor points as well. Some of the topics I'm going to cover for now are going to be things like king safety, that's a huge one, and pieces that are either, for instance, undefended, or maybe they have too many responsibilities there that they are overloaded. Another important point is that you can be sometimes simply threatened to transition from one stage of the game, like the middle game, onto an end game. And that can be a very strong threat. If, for instance, the middle game is okay for you, but on the other hand, the end game is a losing end game, then you really need to be able to identify that. And in that case, in order to figure out that that's a real threat, what you need to do is you need to work on your end games and you need a deeper understanding of that. But anyways, let's actually show you guys a few positions starting with this one. So here the topics I want to discuss are: number 1, the opposite colored bishops that we see on this board. The material is level, each side has 5 pawns, and you know a rook each and a bishop each. But there is a big difference that white has the dark squared bishop and black, on the other hand, has the light squared bishop. What does it mean? Well, it means a couple of things. The first is that any black pawn or piece that is on a dark square is going to be especially vulnerable. So in this case, it would be the rook on e7 and the pawns on a5, b6 and c5. Why? Well, because white has this unopposed dark squared bishop, and so his firepower on the dark square is simply greater than black's. So if you are black in this position, you would really want to be careful. For example, that you don't want to maneuver the rook onto a square like d8, and suddenly you put it on the same diagonal as this pawn on b6, and that would lead to something like a fork here on c7, forking the pawn on b6 and the rook on d8. So this would be one example. Similarly, if you are white here, you have the opposite problem, which is your dark squares are perfectly safe because you have a dark square bishop and black doesn't. But your light squares may come under fire. So again, you would be thinking, well, what do you have on a light square? And as it happens, white has a lot of materials on light squares. The majority of his pieces are on light squares. So that is the first thing that we would think of in terms of what kind of threats may occur. For instance, bishop to d5 attacking our highest value piece should be considered. And also bishop to e4 attacking the base of our pawn chain. This pawn chain here on the queen side, if the base collapses, then after that the next pawn can fall, and then after that the final third pawn can fall, and that can quickly spell disaster. It's the same course for black. And finally, of course, I mentioned the rook as the highest value piece. But that's not really true. I mean, there is a piece that is priceless, and that is the king. And so we should always look at the king's safety. And if we consider king's safety, here we notice that black's white colored bishop is exerting a big pressure on this point on the pawn on g2. Because of the fact that the g2 pawn is at light square and white may struggle to defend himself along those light squares. And we can immediately see a potential threat for black here, and that is the move rook to e2. Rook to e2 would lead black to coordinate his forces, his light squared bishop and his rook, pressuring not only the base of our pawn chain here on c2 on the queen side, but the base of our king side pawn chain. And that would be a real disaster because it would come in with check, and it would actually be a double attack on that bishop and the king. The king would have to move and we would lose the bishop. So therefore, rook e2 is very serious threat. And the light squared bishop is crashing down as it's very near our king, so it compromises our king's safety. One very final detail here, that his rook is better placed than our rook. It's on an open file, while ours is on a closed file. And so his rook can activate itself and enter the second rank. From the white's perspective, we want to make sure that black's rook does not access the second rank, or at least we better have a plan to deal with it if he does so. Here, white, for example, does have a plan because it's him to move. And he says, well, I want to defend at this point. I know that rook e2 I have identified this as a big threat, and now I can take measures against it. I can move rook to f4 with the idea that I'm going to transfer my rook on f2, so in the event of rook e2, now rook would go to f2, and this problem is dealt with. Now rook takes, bishop takes, and we can see that the fire has been extinguished. On the other hand, remember, we also identified this possibility of bishop to e4, hitting the base of the pawn chain. That's a concern because all of the white pawns are on light squares. So what happens if bishop to e4 does? White just resign? Well, not. Quite because the black queen side pawns are also on dark squares. So white cannot defend directly because if you play c3, then bishop to c2, and these pawns are going to be lost one by one. But what he can do is, he can go on the counter attack with the move bishop to g3. Now, bishop takes c2, bishop to c7. Notice, black is going after the base of the white pawn chain, and white is doing the exact same thing and really causing damage with the bishops of their opposite colors. So bishop takes the second white pawn. Bishop takes the first black pawn. Bishop takes the third white pawn. Now bishop takes the second black pawn. As a consequence, black is left up a pawn. But the thing about it is the opposite colored bishops, even being down, it should be enough for white to hold a draw. White should be able to sneak a draw. We are not too concerned here about the outcome of this fictitious game, as I just set up the position myself. But we are more so interested in the process of identifying threats. So here notice that g2 pawn is very weak. It's on a light square. The king of white is a little bit weaker, and the more active rook threatens to go into the second rank. So white spotted all of that and has also spotted the particular arrangement of pawns on the light squares and on the dark squares. So factors those things in the beginning, he deals with the most direct threat, rook e2. And then once that's happened, he is aware that secondary threat comes in, but he has a plan for that, which is, well, this time around, unlike with g2, I can't prevent the threat of capturing my queenside pawn directly, so I let them go, but I use the assets in my position, bishop g3, and I go after your pawns.
I hope this clarifies the understanding of identifying threats on the board. I hope you liked and enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.